greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews, and the second video in which I take the Airfix Boulton Paul Defiant and modify it to create a post-World War II British wonder weapon. So I've previously done a video where I created the Jetfiant Mark I, and in this build I basically take this idea and turn it into a navalized variant. So this aircraft and the second one that you'll see built in this video were both created for a build contest, which was hosted in December by Rex's Hangar, History of Everything, and Lord Hardthrasher. So I'll start off this video talking a bit about how I went about designing the Boulton Paul Defiant, and then I'll show the build process, and if you skip or watch to the end, you'll get to see a little propaganda reel that I did for this aircraft. So without further ado, let's get into it. This Jetfiant would be built in a very similar way to the previous one, using my 3D printer and vacuformer to create the new parts, although the Defiant would require a few extra modifications to make it even cooler, yet also just as impractically flawed as the original Defiant. To make it a better naval jet attacker slash jet night fighter thing, I decided to extend its range for anti-shipping and its fleet defense missions by adding some wingtip fuel tanks. And to give it a bit of an extra punch against ships, and to fix the original Defiant's fault of having no forward firing armament, I finally added a cannon, in the shape of the Tsetse gun from the Mosquito. Yes, a 57mm 6-pounder anti-tank cannon that had been modified for aircraft. This would require the nose to be extended by around about 0.5 meters in 1:1 scale, so that the autoloader and the cannon breech could be squeezed in right behind the sensitive and incredibly delicate radar system. Finally, I also 3D printed a tailhook, and I had some spare scaled down Arado 234 wheels, which would make the gear look a little bit tougher and able to withstand slamming into a carrier deck as a pilot struggles to see over the long nose. I then began the building process, first by cutting out the fuselage halves, followed by the wing parts from the sprues. As with my previous Defiant, the wings were cut with a scribing tool along a raised structural part where the engines would join, and the panels on the underside where the gear retracts were also cut up. Unlike the land-based Defiant, the Defiant would require the very outer edge panel of the wing to be cut off so that I could attach the fuel tanks, so I also did this. The final piece to be cut off was the Rolls-Royce Merlin section for the fuselage, and once that was removed, I sanded the edges of the parts to clean them up and began to reassemble the landing gear bay, making sure it was reversed so that the wheels would better balance the weight of the aircraft. The outer wing, top and bottom parts were then glued together, and while they dried, I glued the floor for the turret to fit into one of the fuselage halves, and began to sand down the raised details on the sidewall since they wouldn't be used and might get in the way of the resin cockpit. I used some scissors to cut out the nose section from the plastic which had been vacuformed, and gave the cockpit and nose a bit of a test fit. The fit was pretty good, so I then cut out the other nose half, cutting off the front section so I could have a removable panel, and began to sand down the sides of the wing roots and the radar operator station. I spent a bit more time with this kit, making sure the new cockpit floor would fit, based on my experience with the previous Defiant where I had some fit issues with the fuselage and the cockpit section. Once the parts had been sanded and the fit was alright, I painted the interior areas of the aircraft with XF71 cockpit green, mixed with a little bit of water to help thin the paint down. After 2 more layers of cockpit green, I then used a fine brush and some Vallejo flat black to pick out the details for the avionics bay, the gun barrel, the radar, the seats, instrument panels, and the nose wheel. Further details such as the cannon's autoloader and breech were painted several coats of XF62 olive drab, while the ammunition shells received several coats of X31 Titan gold, and then I painted the seat cushions XF51 khaki drab, and dry brushed the wires, radar dish and instrument dials with Vallejo flat white. Some XF16 flat aluminium was applied to the switches in the cockpit and the nose wheel, and then I used various colours including Vallejo vermilion red, Vallejo flat yellow, Vallejo deep green, and Tamiya XF53 neutral grey to paint the extra details on the instruments and paint raised switches on the sidewalls. X26 clear green was also applied to the radar screen as I'd done with my other Defiant. After a few touch-ups and coats of the various colours previously mentioned, I then gave the cockpit a coat of Tamiya black panel accent to help highlight any of the recessed and raised details, and after that had dried, I then used some X20 enamel thinners, using a cotton bud to wipe away the excess enamel wash and make it a little bit lighter on the raised areas. Vallejo gloss varnish was also used to create a glass effect on the dials and the radar scope by applying it with a fine brush. The last thing I did to the cockpit was use some 1mm thick Tamiya masking tape to add seatbelts to the two ejection seats, and then I glued the rear fuselage top section and two halves together. The radar operator floor and panel were glued to the center wing section using some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue, and then I glued the wings to the fuselage halves. While the wings and fuselage bonded, I cut out, sanded and attached the rudder and the two horizontal stabilizers. At this stage, I also cut out and assembled the landing gear, which was pretty much identical to the original Defiant's assembly, except for the fact that I cut off the main attachment point for the wheels and used some CA glue to attach some new resin ones, and then added the landing gear doors. I used a bulldog clip to line up the nose section and then slid it to the other fuselage halves, and then glued them together. At the same time, I also glued the jet engines, which had been 3D printed, to the center wing section. Unfortunately, I had a problem with the left engine when I printed it, and with the deadline only about 24 hours away, I didn't really have the time to print and then clean up a new engine. So in the end, I had to make do and tried my best to fill in the deformities with some putty. While the engines and fuselage sections bonded, I glued the tip tanks to the outer wing sections, and after they were solid, the outer wings were then glued to the engine nacelles and held in place using some Tamiya paint jars. With the main model assembly completed, I then used some old Perfect plastic putty and some Vallejo water-based putty to fill in the various gaps present around the aircraft. I did notice a lot less gaps compared to the previous Jet Defiant, thanks to the extra time I'd spent sanding the cockpit before assembly, although there were still quite a few present between the fuselage sections and also where both the wing joined to the fuel tank and the engines. Once the putty had dried, I then sanded down the areas I'd applied it to, along with all of the seam lines, first using a file and then some increasingly fine sandpaper until I had a reasonably smooth result. For the section of nose I'd cut off, I used some blue tack to temporarily fix it in place, so that I could later remove it and see the interior details but hold it there while painting. With the sanding completed, I then moved on to painting. I decided to go with the two-tone 1950s Royal Navy scheme, so I began by painting the lightest colour, which was Tamiya XF21 Sky, which was applied on the underside of the aircraft using a large brush and mixed with a little bit of water to help thin the paint down. After the first layer had been applied and had dried, I then applied a second coat. I should point out that although the Tamiya Acrylics are water-based and can be thinned with water, it actually causes them to dry out and become grainy. Unfortunately, I only learnt about this sometime after doing this build, so I did in fact use water when I probably shouldn't have to thin the Tamiya paints. For the grey upper surface, I went with Tamiya XF24 Dark Grey, which was applied in the same fashion, taking extra care when applying it along the fuselage upper surface to not cross over into the sky too much. After a third coat of sky, I then applied a second coat of the dark grey, in some areas using a smaller brush to apply it with a bit more precision. In between coats, I also cut out my vacuform bubble canopies, which were an improvement over the cage-style canopy on the land-based Jet Defiant. After cutting any excess plastic, I then glued the front windshield and two non-transparent metal sections to the fuselage with Rocket CA glue, and then filled in any gaps with some putty. I then painted the wheel wells 2 coats of interior green, followed by the canopy sections, which received a coat on their framework, and any sections where the interior would be painted over so that it would appear green on the inside. While the green dried, I then added the resin 20mm Hispanos and ammunition to the turret pieces and painted those interior green as well. After a third coat of the interior green, I applied a third layer of XF24 dark grey, also painting the canopy frames and non-transparent sections of the canopy. I painted the struts and details for the landing gear with XF16 flat aluminium, and then gave the canopy section a second coat of the dark grey. To neaten up the canopy frames, I then used a cocktail stick to carefully scratch off any excess paint from any areas I did not want it. A fourth and final coat of sky was applied to the underside, and then I painted the tyres and nose of the aircraft with a few coats of Vallejo flat black. I decided to paint the underside of the tip tanks dark grey rather than having them sky on the underside, and once that had been done, I then painted the filler caps with vermilion red, and used a larger brush to apply some Vallejo water-based gloss varnish over the entire model. This gloss varnish coat helps to protect the paint job and also gives a glossy surface for the decals to be applied on, which helps prevent them from silvering. I gave the gloss varnish 4 hours to dry. Normally I would leave it for a day, but being on a bit of a time crunch, I had to move on. I soaked my transfers in some warm water and then slid them onto the model using my fingers or a brush. I used the original tail decals and some of the common stencils included in this kit, but for the main markings I had to use some spare ones. Some of these ones were quite old and fragile, such as the number 10 which I initially applied on the nose and had to later scrape off and replace with a number 12. Once all the decals were in place, I applied some Tamiya decal adhesive over the top of them to help them conform to the surface details of the model, and then I left the decals to dry for 10 hours. Some of the damaged decals received a few touch-ups with a fine brush, and then I gave the aircraft a coat of semi-gloss varnish to protect the decals, and also give the aircraft a nice uniform and slightly shiny appearance. Some of the smaller parts had been painted on the sprue and at this stage were attached, including a resin tailhook and some of the antennas. I painted the engine exhaust's Vallejo natural steel, before then using a fine brush to dry brush some XF16 flat aluminium onto the aircraft to create some metal chipping. I applied it mainly on the leading edges of the wings, the engine intakes, horizontal stabilizers, and also on the area where the crew would walk along the wing, some of the panel lines near the flaps, the landing gear bay, and on some of the access hatches. The inside of the engine was painted Vallejo flat black to give it some depth, and then I applied and painted flat black some Tamiya 3mm masking tape to add some anti-skid areas on the wings for the crew. The nav lights were initially painted flat aluminium and later painted X26 clear green and X27 clear red to give them a coloured light effect. With all of these smaller accessories painted and then attached to the model, I then moved on to the last stages of weathering. To add a little bit of grime in some of the panel lines and also create a post-shading effect, I applied some Tamiya black panel liner scent, mainly along some of the panel lines, as well as quite heavily in the landing gear bay area and around where there were fuel caps and access hatches to create a bit of a grimy streaking effect. After I'd applied it, I used a cotton bud dipped in some X20 enamel thinners to rub away the excess from the areas where I didn't want it, and also to help streak it backwards in areas such as around the flaps and the landing gear bay. Some additional weathering was done using Tamiya's water-based weathering pigments, mainly the black, which was used to add some gun smoke on the cannons, to add a burnt effect to the jet exhausts, and to create some additional streaking coming from the control hinges and the landing gear. The sand-coloured powder was also used to dry brush the walkway and the tyres, and then I finally added some ejection seat handles using some copper wire, and once this had been painted flat yellow and given some Vallejo flat black striping, the Boulton Paul Defiant Mark I was finally completed. And here you can see the final result, and at the very end of this segment is a small propaganda reel which I put together for this aircraft. I have to say, I had so much fun coming up with the naval modifications for the Defiant, and building it was pretty fun too. I'm very happy with the results I got, given my limited practice with vacuforming technology and the printing, and also the fact that I only had a little bit over 48 hours to finish this for the contest, which I just managed to do. I really love the aesthetics of this plane, especially with the Royal Navy scheme. It kind of looks to me like someone put a Meteor and a Sea Venom in a hangar together, and then 9 months later opened the doors to find this meme of a plane sitting there with Great Uncle Mosquito's 57mm cannon stuck to its nose. There are still a few spots where the sanding and filling were a bit rushed, but I feel like I definitely managed to improve with getting the cockpit and fuselage fit, and also some other areas compared to my previous build. And somehow the turret actually almost sits flush on this one. Not quite sure why, but I'm happy that it does. I think the semi-gloss varnish also managed to really help hide the grainy Tamiya paints, but I am trying to use the proper thinner instead of paints in future builds to see if this prevents the same issues from occurring. Otherwise, that's pretty much it for this build. I really enjoyed it, as I've said, and I may try and do some more Kitbash type projects like this again in the future. I would also like to try and make a video that's a bit more dedicated to the planning stage, if you guys would be interested, of course. For now though, thank you so much for watching this one. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions or suggestions for improvements, or even some crazy modification ideas for some future kits, then let me know in the comment section below. A massive thanks to my wonderful patrons, as always, for helping me fund buying these kits, as well as the paints and products I use to build them, and also the technology I use to modify them. I'll end this video with a little propaganda reel that I made for the build contest of the Boulton Paul Defiant. I hope you enjoy this one, and thanks again for watching. Although the Second World War ended 5 years ago, and we have won, now the Soviets are starting to seem a bit sus. We all know that jet power is the future, so it's probably time to chuck those old prop planes aside and modernise for a potential conflict, probably somewhere cold. But Britain is bankrupt, so how are we going to cheaply build jets? Well, Boulton Paul, the legendary makers of the Defiant, and some other stuff, have the answer. The Super Defiant Mark I night fighter/fighter bomber. Simply take the airframe of the already modern and highly capable Boulton Paul Defiant and slice the wings in half to add 2 Rolls-Royce Derwent engines from the Gloucester Meteor, upgrade the state-of-the-art turret to have extra firepower with 2 20mm Hispano cannons, reverse the direction of the main landing gear to help with the different centre of gravity, extend the nose to add a radar operator, and finally stick some radar from the Mosquito night fighter in the nose, and BAM! But of course, the Navy now wants a better jet than the abysmal Supermarine attacker, so the boffins at Boulton Paul have developed this, the Super Defiant Mark I, featuring tougher looking wheels, a tailhook, folding wings, not featured on this model, extra fuel for long range missions, and to destroy any Soviet ships, planes or submarines that dare get too close to the front of the aircraft, the nose has been extended to add a 57mm 3-pounder Tsetse gun, taken again from a Mosquito, and fitted in behind the delicate radar. This long-nosed early jet is perfectly suited for carrier operations, and it can perform with outstanding success the roles of fleet defense from bombers, attacking Soviet ships/submarines, and of course it does this all way better than the Sea Venom Meteor and the, a Supermarine attacker in every way. And should anything go wrong, as unlikely as that is, 2 Martin Baker ejection seats have been fitted so that at least 2 out of the 3 crew will probably survive. More agile than a Spitfire, faster than a Meteor, and as versatile as the Mosquito, and, like the Mosquito, once the engineers have figured out where we're going to put the bombs on the wings, it will surely carry more bombs than a B-17, if you completely ignore range. And being so cheap to produce, we're positive the Defiant will be highly popular with overseas carrier operators like America or Australia, thanks to us. And who knows, maybe even the great Generalissimo of the glorious nation of Albonia himself, when he gets an aircraft carrier that is, will purchase the Super Defiant, the outstanding British naval jet fighter of the future.